All right, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jason Carroll. Dr. Carroll is a fellow at the Wheatley Institution, one of the co-sponsors of this event. He's a professor of marriage and family studies in the School of Family Life at BYU. Jason is an internationally recognized researcher and educator in the areas of marital intimacy, marriage readiness among young adults, and modern threats to marriage such as pornography, delayed marriage, materialism, and premarital childbirth. His work has been featured in The Economist, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, LA Times, USA Today, NPR, and even The Tonight Show. I would have liked to have seen that one. Jason was the research director and co-author of the highly publicized National Marriage Project report entitled Not Yet, that's spelled K-N-O-T, Not Yet, The Costs and Benefits of Delayed Marriage in America. Jason received his PhD in Family Social Science from the University of Minnesota, and at BYU he is the lead instructor of the Marriage Prep course, which educates 1,500 students per year. And in the job that I had previous to the IFS, I actually went around to college campuses and we did an educational program and the Constitution and the founding and free markets and all that, and had several events where we had a lot of BYU students. And I was talking with one of the participants today in the audience, and BYU is one of the few schools that actually have a pretty high percentage of undergraduates that are married, which used to be something that, when my parents went to college, they lived as undergraduates in married student housing. That's just not happened today. So again, things have changed. But 1,500 students a year go through that. Pretty cool. He lives in Provo with his wife, Stephanie, and you're not doing as well as Brad, but only 5 children, right? So, okay. His talk is entitled, Before You Do, Key Lessons for Young Adults Preparing for Marriage. Jason Carroll.
Thanks, Rich. Did I get my mic turned on? All right. Okay, batting cleanup, that's what they call it, right? So I've been sitting here going through all the presentations and going, okay, scratch that out, okay, that's good. Okay, hey, there's a gap we can fill in. So anyway, we'll try to do a bit here of pulling things together for us. First off, I've got a question for Galena. I've got a new study question that needs to go in the next one. Do you have a study that asks the question about what does it mean if people don't remember to wear their wedding ring? This was the picture I got from my wife as I got to the airport headed to this conference. She said, you left a single man, right? The bad thing on this is the third time this has happened when I've gone to a marriage conference. You also noticed probably the not so accidental leaving behind of the Fitbit too. I've just, knowing your steps is fun for a little while, and after that it just gets darn right annoying, you just don't want that anymore. So anyway, had to throw that one in. That was the picture I got as I was headed out the door. Well, let's see, get ourselves kind of set here. A number of years ago, Chief Justice John Roberts came to BYU and visited with us. He told us he spent his entire career, starting all of his public speaking, making jokes about his profession. Although he questioned later on if that was a good way to go because all the lawyers in the audience didn't think the jokes were funny and nobody else thought that they were jokes. So I've always thought for some time, okay, what can I tell? Do I have a joke about my profession? There's not any jokes out there about marriage researchers, but there are some jokes about marriage therapists, and that's in the background for me a little bit. So let's try one of those, see if we can get ourselves going here a bit. So a couple goes in to see a therapist. I'm sure this is not Galena's practice. This is very, very different. Goes in to see a therapist, and the therapist turns to them and says, why have you come to see me today? And as is sometimes the case, the wife speaks up and starts going. Kind of gets the list going of things. And the husband settles back and starts listening. The therapist settles back and starts listening. And after several minutes of this, the therapist stands up, walks around his desk, pulls the wife out of her chair, gives her a passionate kiss, and then steps back and looks at the husband and says, that is what your wife needs at least 3 times a week. Do you think you can handle that? The husband thinks for a minute and says, well, I can bring her in on Mondays and Wednesdays, but I golf on Fridays. Now, what does that have to do with what we're going to talk about today? Absolutely nothing. But it is at least something to get us rolling a bit. If I had a chance, I would have actually changed the title of my talk, but you don't do that once the programs have been printed. What I'd like to do, and I think this might work as a little bit of a summary piece for us and pulling together a little bit our conversation. So there'll be some things that we'll try to build on of what's been talked about. There'll be some other parts I'll move through more quickly that I'll just be showing you some additional evidences of things that the other speakers have highlighted. But let me back up just a bit here. Calling myself a marriage researcher really isn't the best title. If I had to label myself, I'm a marriage developmentalist. My early training was working with Tom Holman and the premarital lab at BYU, which is one of the larger labs in the country that studies premarital prediction of later marital success. Okay, and so we study dating couples, engaged couples, and then you follow them into marriage and say, what is it about that premarital experience that is predicting later success? A la what Galena was explaining and getting into this idea of premarital. And in the same direction, my entire career has been moving in, we got to go a stage sooner. We got to go a stage sooner. And part of this, too, is my firm belief. Usually when we talk about development, we study development in a kind of going forward fashion. We start with the first stage, and then it moves to the next stage and to the next stage. I'm not convinced that's the best way necessarily to think about development. Because as much as development builds upon its foundations, it also fundamentally hangs from its apex. What I mean by that is oftentimes to understand development towards a particular outcome, particularly something we might label as optimal development, it's best to understand that and then go backwards of what gets somebody to that point. I have 2 daughters, a lot of dance, a lot of recitals, right? We've moved through beginning, we've moved through intermediate, we celebrated getting toe shoes, right? All the developmental milestones of dance. But I had an opportunity. I think I shared this with Brad once before. My wife and I, a couple of years ago, on a trip to Boston that she went with me, we took the opportunity to see the Boston Ballet. Now, I've seen recitals, but this was something completely different, right? In that world of dance and ballet, this would be an example of optimal development. You saw this outcome, this desired outcome. So it could be one thing to go back and look at my daughters and say, how did they get up to there? But in some ways, what I'm trying to highlight for you is the value of going to the prima ballerina and going backwards. And how did you go from there? The reason why this makes a difference is when it comes to young adulthood, this changes how we frame and talk about all of these issues that have been highlighted today. Too much of the problem right now of making a difference in the thinking of young adults is that they don't have a far enough horizon, or we're not presenting them with and helping them see a far enough horizon. And so the consequences of behaviors and choices so often are just framed within that time period alone. The academy, scholars, researchers are doing this in a tremendous degree in the area of emerging adulthood. The Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood, a new growing academic group with their national conferences, with their journals, a lot of great research, a lot of great work being done, all of it with a vision that is about as far as that young adult time period. So when relationships and sexuality and these things are talked about, they're evaluated just with, what about right now? But if you take this idea of a developmental lens, you want to start going out to those outcomes, right, and bringing them back. And as I've been doing this type of work over the years and moving from early marriage to engagement to now emerging adults and convinced and echoing what Kay was saying this very morning about, I don't know, I think it might even need to be sooner than that before it gets too entrenched and too much of the peer culture kicks in. My experience is that 12 and 13-year-olds still really want to do things right. Might be a good place to be with some of this education and thought. But what I've become convinced of is one way to frame all of these patterns we've been talking about today is in this idea of marriage preparation paradoxes, right? What I mean by paradox, there's a couple of different definitions used with this, but a paradox is a proposition that, despite apparently sound reasoning, leads to a conclusion that is senseless, logically unacceptable, or self-contradictory. We've had that comment made, and as I've had that sensitivity thinking about my remarks at the end of today, all of the presenters have made comments at times about things that this seems contradictory, this seems to go against what's intended, right? Now, the part I want to highlight for us, and what I'll focus most of my comments on, is around this idea of despite apparently sound reasoning. We will never make an impact in changing the cultural dialogue around these issues we've been hitting today unless we really appreciate the reasoning that young people today, and even many times their parents and others as well, are taking to justify the path and patterns that we see emerging. It's not haphazard in many ways. There's a certain logic, if you will, behind it, a common sense. Well, of course that must be. And so there's these intended, hoped-for outcomes, and as we've started to highlight, and I'll show you more today, young people get the opposite of what even they themselves are intending. My best everyday example of a paradox is turning a jar lid the wrong way. You think you're loosening it, and you're just going harder, and I've got to do more. And of course, what are you doing? Getting the exact opposite. You're tightening it, you're making it worse, you're making it difficult. So there's this idea of this. So if we think of marriage preparation in this way, a marriage preparation paradox are behaviors that are believed to increase one's chances of marriage success, but they actually, on average, diminish one's chances of having a loving and lasting relationship. Framing it this way and trying to explore the reasoning behind the paradox becomes an important part of engaging in some fundamentally different conversations about the marriage preparation topics we've been highlighting today, and I'll introduce a few new ones for us as well. So the cohabitation paradox, this is a great one just kind of to throw out there. Galena covered that. We won't spend much time with it, but this is the classic example of what we've seen over the years as a paradox. Some of our best and brightest minds back in the 1970s and 80s in the social sciences were declaring that we were going to see a huge drop in the divorce rate. Why? Because we were seeing this increase amount of cohabitation. And the idea was that cohabitation was going to act as this Darwinian survival of the fittest mechanism that would weed out the weak relationships from the herd, and only the strong ones would survive, and they would move in. That becomes the logic, the test drive hypothesis. Now, Galena's helped us see here, too, that we've got a couple of different ways that people are getting in, and some aren't using much logic, but they are still putting it in the backdrop of, it couldn't hurt to test this. We need to learn more. We need to get more information, right? But we now have a generation's worth of data and evidence that has showed us that the exact opposite is the case. Couples that cohabit before marriage have not been found to do better off, right? Now, some of the new research is coming out trying to say, well, maybe this association has diminished, but let's be absolutely clear what the new studies are doing. At best, they're trying to find a small portion or some segment of cohabiting couples that still look as good as those who didn't cohabit. No study has ever shown the proposed idea that you would actually benefit from cohabitation. Now we're just trying to show that you're not going to be harmed by it, in some ways, if there's some level of commitment, there's still some backdoor version of cohabitation. If you somehow marry that person and it's the only one you cohabit, you can still be as good as the people who never cohabited in the first place, right? Is kind of where we're going with that. Now, how do we break that logic down for a moment? Why doesn't the test drive hypothesis work? That sounds like a perfectly logical idea. You wouldn't buy a car without test driving it, right? But if you went and test drove a red car and said, yes, I'm going to buy this, you drive it up to the dealership, you go in to do the paperwork, you come walking out, and they pull up a white car out of the car wash for you and say, there you go. That's not the car I test drove. Yeah, it is. Now how sold are you on a test drive idea? One of the big myths in thinking that we aren't helping young people really appreciate is that relationships are not just relationships. Test driving cohabitation really in many ways has very little to do with test driving marriage. They're not the same. And people don't behave the same. Who's the person who knows that better than anybody? Joe and Jane Cohabiter. Go ask them. Hey, Joe Cohabiter, I heard that cohabitation is the same as marriage, so why don't you just marry Jane? Whoa, did she put you up to this? Did her mom talk to you? Joe knows full well that the cohabitation bargain is quite different than the marriage commitment, right? Well, we saw the data before. They don't have the same level of financial investment, shared account, family accountability. I don't have to talk to your mom on the phone. I don't have to go, all these types of things. People invest differently. A good way to think of this, it's like comparing people who are homeowners and those who are renters, right? Do a little study. Go down to Home Depot. They're everywhere. Do a little study. Stand outside Home Depot, and as people come out, just ask them, will you answer one question for me? Are you a homeowner or a renter? What are you going to find out? Overwhelmingly, they're going to be homeowners. What? People in rental apartments are completely satisfied with their carpet? Right? Think of the times you've rented. Did you not want new carpet? Of course you did. Why are the homeowners putting in carpet? Why are the renters not? It's a different vision. It's a long-term vision. It's actually creating a different way of functioning and living and being. So while there's some learning about a relationship, of course, in a cohabitation situation, it's not the same as marriage. The test drive notion is flawed from the very beginning. But that's the type of logic we have to get in and start to expose. Why aren't things happening the way that they're believed, and help young people see the paradoxes of what they're intending to do and what they're trying to do. One thing I still trust, the data comes back quite well, and I think the other speakers today would agree with this. The aspirations of young people today are still quite high and marriage-oriented. Now, some of the expectations are dropping from what they aspire to, but as far as what the end destination is, we still see evidence that 80% plus of young adults in America today desire to have a successful lifelong marriage. So in many ways, it's helping them realize how some of these very strategies or approaches or behaviors are not leading to their very own goals and expectations, and helping us see in ways that this ties in and gives that type of direction. Let's talk about another one, the sexual chemistry paradox, right? We've seen a lot of data points today talking about sexuality, being involved with people prior to marriage and those types of things. All of it goes down to what we'd call in our culture, what I would label as the sexual chemistry approach or model, that very much espouses the idea that you need to test sexual chemistry before moving into different commitment milestones. So there's a strong amount, large number of young people today who would believe you need to test sexual chemistry before you get exclusive with somebody. And then there's an even greater degree of young people that say, you need to test that sexual chemistry before you get engaged. And then there's an overwhelming majority that would say, you need to test that before you get married. Notice the language is not, it's permissible, it's okay. The language is, it is needed. And the other core thing that we see out there is that sexual chemistry is seen as something separate and distinct from the rest of the relationship. We see this in pop culture all the time. A relationship's going well, they're dating, they're happy, he treats me well, she's great, but I still don't know if you have sexual chemistry, right? It's something out there, it's mysterious, that's why we use the term like chemistry or compatibility with that. Two main hypotheses are coming out of this idea. One is this test drive hypothesis, very much like cohabitation, that within that relationship, you need to test your sexual chemistry before you push on to these later approaches. The other is what I'd call the sow your wild oats hypothesis, right? And Galena talked a little bit about this. We have this language. It's almost become universal in our culture that we talk about people hitting their young adult years and needing to settle down. Now, what we've done to the term sowing wild oats is a perfect example of cultural meaning change. Back in the day, what in the world did sowing wild oats mean? Wild oats actually refers to a plant that's called Avena fatuna. It's a plant that farmers for centuries have despised. Because as it gets into a wheat field, it looks just like the wheat. And so you can't, and so it's just, so the phrase was always created as a way, particularly of young men, wasting their time in at least frivolous, if not possibly harmful and problematic behavior. Sowing wild oats was the idea of, you're going to get yourself a field full of weeds. Now look what we've done. We've moved it in the direction, probably moving through a stage of this being permissible to now being something that is seen as required. And if you don't sow your wild oats, what's going to happen? Well, you'll still be a wild one when you get to marriage. You got to get that out of your system so that you'll be willing to settle down. Again, the logic that's behind it, even if it's put in those terms or not, very much becomes the idea. And parents and others, I think that we started to get that in that last conversation, and education for parents. We do need to have some serious consideration of the messages that parents are giving to young adults and how that is contributing to the ways that this is seen and this is approached. Now, we've done some work in the Relate Institute in the School of Family Life at BYU. We've looked particularly at this idea of sexual timing. That question came up a little bit earlier. Is there any data that looks at how soon couples become sexually involved with each other? In this study, we actually took married couples and had them retrospectively report and say, how soon in your relationship did you become sexually involved? And now across several data sets, we've seen a common pattern that you can identify what we'd call early sex couples. These are couples that become sexually involved with each other within the first month of their relationship. Data from the AdHealth data set shows us that that's about 40 to 50% of couples now in young adult fit into that early sex pattern. Might be these hookups that keep going, so to speak. We have a later sex group that waits at least that time period. We think that roughly captures them getting into a relationship. It's not just a hookup, but they do become sexually involved prior to marriage. And then we do see in most data sets, and ours included, that there is a married sex group. It's usually only about 8 to 10% of the sample and the pattern, but we do see a couple that does that, right? Now again, remember what the hypothesis, sexual chemistry hypothesis would say, that you need to test this early in the relationship. So therefore, what would sexual chemistry say about a married sex pattern? That's like buying the car without test driving it. That's a disaster. That's something that is going to lead you to some real problems and difficulties. What we did in this study is actually compared the three groups on the satisfaction levels in their marriages, the stability levels in their marriages, the sexual quality in their marriages, and also the level of communication. What we see is a pattern where clearly the married sex couples are not harmed by following this type of pattern. And this going slow idea, avoiding some of those premarital commitments or entanglements, one of which may very much be that type of sexual partnering, right? Now again, if you didn't want to overstate the data and say, well, this is one study, again, at the very least, you don't see the perceived benefits of testing sexual chemistry, right? So at the very least, that pattern's doing no harm, but our data, and now Sharon Sassler has done a study that came out as well, confirmed these same findings with her group at Cornell, and we're starting to see the evidence of a paradox that's emerging, a behavior that's believed to help them evaluate if a relationship has what's needed for that later experience, and it's now having the counterproductive, the counterintuitive, the paradoxical experience here. Now, this was my ace in the hole. I knew that when we got to this hour, what do I have that can absolutely be unique? Oh, I'll pull out the pornography data. That'll get us alive and keep us going, right? The Relate Institute has one of the few and definitely the largest data set in the country of couples, matched couples, with some pornography data and getting a sense of what's going on. I didn't bring all of this, but I thought it'd be something worth flavoring and putting into our thoughts here. I wouldn't go so far as saying that the common belief among young people today is that pornography is something that will necessarily benefit their marriages. It might. Oprah seems to think so. But at the very least, there's the general idea that it won't harm you. This is a part of that sowing wild oats, doing the teenage youth thing, right? And that ultimately this shouldn't be anything that would have any type of long-term effects. In fact, there's a general idea for many patterns in young adulthood. The myth in the thinking is that there's kind of a light switch hypothesis. I'm doing single life, right? And I'm just doing the stuff in single life, and then when I'm ready to do married life, or I'll just flip the switch and it'll all be different. And I'll talk to you in a minute about why I think that type of meaning doesn't work. We did a study that we published a few years back that looked at a sample of young adults all across the country. I just wanted to show this one to you to highlight what is by far the most common replicated finding when it comes to pornography studies. There is a massive, I mean massive, gender gap. Regardless of what anyone thinks about pornography in a moral stance, in a value stance, right? This is clearly, even if someone sees it as a benign issue, which many would not, and I clearly do not, you still have this issue about a coupling pattern. Look at what we see in this national sample. Look at the amount of young men and young women, emerging adulthood single men and emerging adulthood single women, who report no pornography viewing in the last 12 months. It's 70% to 14%. And then if you cluster the more habitual patterns, viewing it at least weekly, and in many cases on a every other day, daily basis, we see nearly half of the men in this young adult sample reporting that type of use. We see 3% of women reporting that type of use. Now, we've followed this up in some of our couple data sets, and we've looked at the same type of issue in dating couples, cohabiting couples, married couples, and we continue to see a large discrepancy and gap in this type of pattern. Now, we could look at that and say, well, okay, what does a gap necessarily mean, right? But it definitely has some implication for couple relationships. It definitely means some of these patterns that are perhaps starting in teenage years. And make no mistake, I think this is barely scraping the tip of the iceberg, because we haven't even seen the generation yet that is really starting with the 10, 11, 12-year-old patterns of early viewing as we've moved to the pocket porn and to the wireless and to the, parents right now still catching up, and I'm talking to numerous parents that don't realize that you can access porn through social media sites. What? Oh, no, they don't have a browser. We don't give them content. We just gave them a phone just so they can get on Instagram, they can just get on Twitter. Yeah, you can get porn through Twitter. What? Yeah, Twitter porn. You can get Twitter porn. What are you talking about? It's right there, right? And so we have this pattern where we're seeing increased exposure, oftentimes in the very devices the parents themselves are handing to children, as our cell phone arms race keeps moving it earlier and earlier, and the quest of kindergartners to have smartphones is coming upon us. Let me give you some examples. These are just little samplings of where we start to see some of these problems emerging. This graph is an interesting one. This is looking at married men's pornography use, okay? In the blue bars, you see his report of how frequently he's viewing pornography. What you see in the tan bars is the wife's report of what she thinks he's doing, okay? Now, so you see how many of them believe that it's never, and that's not the case. But if you summarize this and pull this together, you can do a little difference score. 47% of wives, the difference score is 0. They reported the exact thing that he reported. So you're kind of going, hey, that's half of couples. That's actually more than I thought it might be. But look at what happens if you get above that. You've got nearly 40% of couples where his use is more than she believes it to be. Now, particularly in some situations where this really gets into couples' relationships and their rules and their boundaries and their sexual scripts, if her script is that that number should be 0, even a discrepancy of 1 point or 2 points could signal something for us that we'd really want to pay attention to in couple relationships. There is a poor, unfortunate group of about 14% of men that she's reporting more, and he's not, that's just not where I'm at, type of pattern of things. I didn't put in the wife's graph that we have the same thing. It's 85% correct response. Husbands just report, and most of it's because, as you saw before, the amount of non-use is very, very high. So it's very, very infrequent. We have a very different pattern going on. Even with women who accept and report that they use pornography, it doesn't look anything like this habitual, regular, daily, weekly type of pattern. Now, this is an interesting graph that I think would be easy to move past. We also asked these couples to rate how much pornography has been a source of conflict in their relationships. Now, make sure as you interpret this graph, we're looking at dating couples, we're looking at cohabiting couples, and we're looking at couples within the first 3 years of marriage. And we're finding consistently across the board about 1 in 7, 1 in 8 of these couples already reporting conflict and struggles around this part of the relationship. And from the slide that we saw before, much of this might just be because the discrepancies are not yet known or are not yet understood. But even in these very basic measures, we may have young people taking on a very paradoxical belief. Maybe it's a half paradox, right? It's not something they think will help them that's hurting them or vice versa, but it's something they think will be in the middle. This won't harm me. This won't have an impact. Yet clearly, this is starting to show up as a coupling issue that, of course, impacts couple relationship, meaning making around this. All of the evidence ultimately points us towards the benefits of sexual restraint. Not just this data, but the data that Galena shared, that the other presenters have shared. We're seeing an empirical evidence base coming across multiple data sets that show us the benefits of sexual restraint. That rather than the idea of sexual chemistry preceding commitment, that there's something powerful when commitment precedes sexual experience. And here, like we said before, one of the mistakes is that they believe relationships are relationships. One of the biggest problems that we're falling into now is too many young people are believing that sex is just sex. And all these frequency counts and number of partners and all of these things assume that there's a difference there of degree, when in actuality there's a difference of kind. And that it's a fundamentally different experience when it is in the context of commitment, particularly within the context of marital commitment, because that's the reality of human sexuality. It never has been or ever will be simply a physical body arousal experience, because that's not just who we are. We had a little bit of mention earlier today. We talked about attachment. We talked about belonging, our need to be connected, to love and be loved. Sexual intimacy has deep possibility and capacity for meaning that goes far beyond just simply the physical that is shared between the two. And interestingly enough, even if you want to talk about our understandings of the physical experience, Galena's little video gave us a nice primer on what we're starting to learn about brain chemistry. Sexual response, physically, originates in the brain. So what we interpret, what we make sense of, what we give that experience to, and this is where the misnomer's at. Sexual chemistry is not something separate from the rest of the relationship. It's the very symbol and expression of what is in the rest of the relationship. When there's commitment, there's trust, there's love, there's bonding, the experience is fundamentally different and it's fundamentally better because that's who we are as humans. We share not just our bodies, but we share our minds, our hearts, our souls in these experiences. Our whole culture is getting washed away in a safe sex rhetoric that somehow it's all about pregnancy and STDs or STIs, pick your most frequent use, when there's so much more of what ultimately can be at that foundation of what we'd emphasize. And that helps them then do this intentional selection hypothesis, right? Adding on to what Galena highlighted there, romantic attraction triggers those brain chemicals, but sexual involvement triggers them tenfold. So part of having that intentional partner selection, it'll still be there. There'll be a little bit of that dopamine rush caught up in the romantic part of it, but if you become sexually involved, you'll release the oxytocin and the dopamine tenfold, right? And there's your possibility of absolutely falling for someone who may not ultimately be best for us. So I think this is a lot about teaching young people about sexual symbolism. What do you want sex to mean in your life? And do you express yourself in those ways that are congruent with that meaning? Do you want it to be a symbol of that commitment? Do you want it to strengthen and be tied to that in ways that will ultimately create a very different fundamental experience? But we've got to go back to the very premises of what we're talking about. If all we do is engage in the simple conversation about sex is sex, we don't even capture that greater idea of sexual wholeness and the emotional and the psychological and the physical and the spiritual ultimately being united and connected in that type of experience and in that type of relationship. Let me touch on this one because there was a question that came up a little bit earlier too about the age data. I'll move through this one pretty quickly. But this is the older is better paradox. We've had an entire generation, right, that has heard about teenage marriages. And it's widely known. It's about as high as what people see with the divorce rate patterns, that ultimately there's this idea that older is better. And we see a clear trend and pattern where the median age of marriage continues to increase and continues to get higher. Is this the case? Now, I think Brad did a good job this morning when he highlighted that it can be a pretty complex situation depending on what you're looking at. Are you looking at income? Or you're looking at educational attainment, other things? But if you look at the data that we have coming out on relationship quality, how is age of marriage associated with the quality of the marriage relationship itself? This is what we've understood for the last 25 years. We've tended to always do studies that compared age of marriage to marital stability, to the divorce rate. And this is what we tended to see. It's the best graph I've seen on it. Age of marriage is a very strong predictor of marital outcomes until it turns the corner. And I've said this to my students for years, and I'll now say it to all the other experts in the room. Does anybody else know a social science variable that looks like this? This is the quintessential social science, it depends, when it doesn't just mean it depends, right? This is truly a statistical it depends on where you're at. Here it's having all of this impact, and then it so greatly flattens out. But there's that little tail down there, and for a long time we've known that those plus 30 marriages and even later were even a little bit more stable. And we've always assumed it's because they're better. And that is the reason, that's the logic behind the older is better paradox. Because that's the notion. There's always better. You're going to find yourself. I love that term. We're always out in young adulthood trying to find ourselves. Wasn't sure we got lost, but somehow we got lost and got to go find ourselves, right? And somehow we got to find ourselves before we can be in a relationship. It's widely embraced. You can't love others until love yourself. Somehow that always involves going in the corner and somehow learning to love yourself, and then you'll be ready for other people. Oftentimes in reality, it's the opposite of that. You really won't love yourself until you learn to love others, because that's back to who you are again and who I am and this relational being and attachment creatures. And evolutionary psychologists have it well. They've got the right idea. We're pair bonding creatures. So part of where we find our identity, our meaning, our purpose is in those relationships, not just outside of them. All right? But I won't take too much time with this as our time gets shorter. But Norval Glenn, University of Texas in 2010, published what I consider to be a very landmark address or article. He took 5 data sets, right? And said, I'm not sure if looking at age of marriage and just simply divorce rates tells us the picture. What about relationship quality? And the rough, crude measure that he was able to get in these 5 data sets was satisfaction. How happy are people in their relationships? What Glenn found in all 5 of these data sets was a curvilinear relationship. Right? They found the evidence that there's a curvilinear relationship between age of marriage and marital happiness, and that the greatest likelihood of being in an intact marriage of the highest quality is among those who marry between ages of 22 and 25. So after that age benefit of divorce flattens out, there seems to be a part of a piece here where we see the happiest couples, right, with that high level of intact is in that time period. Glenn and his colleagues concluded that marital success apparently increases with age at marriage only up to the early to mid-20s, with increases in marital survival beyond those ages resulting entirely from a greater tendency for persons to remain in mediocre or poor marriages. Now, stop the presses. Mediocre or poor marriage? Oh, we must be talking about teenage marriages. That's what we've done for a generation, is talked about, well, that must be the teenage marriage. No. That's those later marriages, right? They're not having the highest level of stability because of that level of quality. Now, I won't take too much time with this, but in the Not Yet report and with Brad's data, we came back and examined that, found the same curvilinear pattern. We saw that in the plus 30 marriages, very low level of divorce, but we also found a very high level of unhappiness, right? And that the highest level then of those that were happy were in those mid-20 marriages. We went back in the Relate Institute, looked at the same data, or looked at the same issue, found the same curvilinear relationship. This is 7 data sets now that we're seeing this pattern and this evidence that those later marriages are not faring as well in the quality and the satisfaction. This one looked at communication, looked at relationship satisfaction, and the red line there is actually capturing the pattern of sexual quality reported in the relationship. Right? Now, we've also looked at Marital Horizons. Brad talked about this earlier, that some of these changes and benefits of this transition to marriage aren't just happening when people actually get married, but it's actually when they start to plan for and think that it's a more likely goal in their pattern. So many of the lifestyle patterns and the resulting health benefits that were previously assumed to be associated with the transition to marriage may in fact be initiated when young people anticipate marriage in their near future. I think that might be a little bit of moving away from some of those patterns that Kay was telling us about this morning. That if you start to even anticipate that, that's not Adam Sandler, right? It's got to be something different. It's got to be more intentional that that's a life goal or pattern that's there. Now, I want to be clear with this data. I wouldn't overstate it. Rather than seeing this as something that says, oh, wow, let's get really worried about the plus 30 marriages. I don't think that's the conclusion. But the data does show us that there is much greater health and well-being and strength in some of those early to mid-20 marriages than we ever give them credit for. The idea that somehow they are doomed to failure, right, and is not what we're seeing in this. And in fact, many of these may be couples that are showing more of a cornerstone approach to marriage rather than a capstone one, as we talked about in the Not Yet report. A cornerstone is a stone that gets laid first, and then other stones are laid in relation to it, whereas a capstone comes after the others have been laid. I don't think this is just in timing and sequence. I actually think this is also an issue about identity. That regardless of when marriage comes, where does it fit in someone's life and adult identity? Does it get laid down first, and then other opportunities, possibilities, and chances actually get seen through that lens? I think that's what we were highlighting in the lunch session, right? Some intentional thinking. What do I want my life to be? If that's a part of my identity, I should start here thinking about what my life would look like and put those stones together, so to speak, in that way. Of course, it's very important whenever we talk about age of marriage, make sure that you're very clear that this is not always a marker of choice. We see some clear evidence that young people are not marrying at ages simply because that's when they choose. In fact, there's some growing evidence that there's increasingly a culture that is not what they would choose. We see in the Ad Health data set that by age 25, over 50% of men and 80% of women are either married or wish they were married. That's a far greater percentage than where that's actually happening and occurring. Again, what is the support around them? What is the support in families? What is the support in cultures and other patterns of that? The biggest thing I'd highlight when it comes to age of marriage is it's factors other than age. Once we get past that point of age benefit, other factors are far stronger predictors. We'd be far better off to teach young people patterns of healthy relationships, how to evaluate relationships, whether they should go forward, whether they're ready, whether they're prepared, and teach them that when the quality relationships are available, to go forward with them. I'm seeing an increasing pattern of young people turning away from otherwise quality relationship opportunities because it's too early, is what they're being told. And frequently they're getting down the path and looking back saying, that wasn't so bad. If I had that do-over, maybe I would have prioritized that relationship. Maybe I'd have that opportunity. So some things to help us think about that culture and that pattern. A couple of last things here, and then we can talk a little bit. A few years ago, I'm trying to remember who mentioned it. Someone talked about the healthy marriage monies that came out. That fun Healthy Marriage Initiative monies got me and Scott Stanley and Paul Amato to go bouncing around the country for a few weeks together, running focus groups on young adults all around the country. And one of the things that struck us the most in these focus groups, because we'd run 6 or 7 in a row, is we'd bring in a bunch of 20-something singles and listen to them talk about marriage issues. And right after them, we'd bring in a group of 20-something marrieds. We did this in Nashville, Boston, here in California. We went all over the country doing this. And the same pattern emerged. The 20-something singles would sit and talk about marriage as a transition of loss. This is what you give up. This is what you have to stop doing. This is what you're going to lose. This is what you're, right? All this pattern. And then the very next group would come in of the 20-something marriages, and all they would talk about was how marriage was a gain and what it added to their life. We kept saying to ourselves, we have to introduce them. We have to, that would be the best focus group. We got to just put them together and see what they would say with each other, kind of challenging in that kind of pattern. We looked at this in the Not Yet report as well. The data shows us that the benefits we've understood for marriage in general also apply to the 20-something marriages that we see as well. We see lower levels of depression. We see higher levels of life satisfaction by those that have moved into the marriage context, right? And so clearly there's patterns there where that idea that this will simply act as a transition of loss, this will be something that will have that detrimental effect, doesn't tend to hold up. So there's a number of ways here that we can start thinking about the paradoxes, the things that don't pan out, the things don't really fit the so-called common sense of the current dating climate and context. So this will be a lot that I think ties in with some of Galena's main ideas there. So how do we move from paradox to true preparation, to true readiness, right? I am finding that one of the key things we need to do is help young people understand that the divorce rate is not uniform. Now, if you've been paying attention to this, there's a whole little debate going on right now about what actually is the divorce rate, and everybody's heard the 50%, and the demographers are now having this fun little measurement squabble with each other about how you measure this, and Paul Amato keeps sitting in the backdrop just going, yeah, it's 42 to 43. Put in the 5% of permanent separations, and it's about 47, 48, and everybody else is all kind of squabbling. It doesn't really matter where that number ends up, and it's a very difficult number to project, and the Institute of Family Studies just did a nice blog that, go take a look at it. They walk through it. Scott Stanley does a great job of trying to walk through that. Regardless of where that comes down, the false idea here is that the divorce rate is uniform. I see young adults all the time who talk as if their marriage is going to be a coin toss. It's a 50-50 proposition. And I always tell them that if that's actually the case, they have my full permission to freak out. That would freak me out, right? But we understand this. We understand this in our culture in other ways very differently, that these things are not uniform. If we had a 50% heart attack rate, we're not quite there in the United States. We're getting there, right? But if we had a 50% heart attack rate, does that mean that every person has the same chance of having a heart attack? Of course not. Hamburger Joe over here eats hamburgers, breakfast, lunch, dinner, washes them down with a fifth of vodka, and smokes 3 packs a day, and is 50 pounds overweight. What's his chance of a heart attack? I mean, that's just a fall in with a gurney. That's not if, that's when, right? That one's coming. That's a 90% plus. But Salad Sally over here, right? Hopefully having a hamburger once in a while, but staying healthy, doing different things, can change her profile and her possibility quite a bit. The same thing's true of divorce. Helping young people understand that there's choices, there's decisions to help them shape that. And we've already identified, and the discussions today have identified so many of these factors that when those are in play, the actual divorce rate of those couples is much, much, much lower than 50%. And so understanding that, I think, is also a part of kind of breaking through some of the concerns and why people are so willing to buy into some of these paradoxes in the first place. Hopefully you've seen today and had reinforced the idea of the success sequence that we see. One of the biggest problems right now in our country is that some of our higher educated individuals are not willing to preach what they practice. And so ultimately the pattern they encourage for their own children and for their own families is not something that they speak up for publicly in what happens in the broader culture. And so we see a college-educated group that's largely following the preparation, commitment, marriage, children type pattern, but we don't see a willingness to try to encourage that, get that kind of consensus we talked about around that when it comes to our lower income populations in the country. But that success sequence is critical. That non-marital childbirth rate that is increasing is got all of the possibility here of entrenching a generational pattern if we don't get that turned around, where the worst will just kind of continue to get worse in some of those ways. Trajectory matters. I love Galena's findings there about commitment congruence. We've got way too many of our young people who follow a pattern of what I'd call half a boyfriend is better than no boyfriend. And so we have young people getting into relationships where they accept that half commitment. They recognize the incongruence of the commitment. And rather than seeing it as the risk factor that Galena and Scott have identified it to be, they push ahead, hoping to get commitment a piece at a time, and hoping that somehow the scales will balance and this will somehow become a mutual balanced relationship, when we see that that's often not the case. We see some great research coming out on-again, off-again relationships. I think part of this is influenced by the fact that there's a common ethic today that breakups need to be friendly. You need to stay friends with your ex. You need to stay in contact with them. You need to still text them. You need to keep them on your Facebook page. That's why we have new studies coming out in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships called Sex with Your Ex, and all these kind of fun things that are going on. In many ways, we need to teach our young people not just how to build relationships, but also how to end them. And even someone that you have deep affection for, and say, I care about you enough to let this really end. And you go forward and have a true opportunity for a new relationship without you trying to explain to your new boyfriend or your new girlfriend why you're texting me And, well, yeah, I know she was my girlfriend, but not anymore. Well, not anymore doesn't really work with that. You can't change the symbolism of that relationship that easily and just become buddies after that's occurred. So we see a lot of the people going back and forth to these on-again, off-again relationships. The data shows that they're a train wreck. They're not a good way to go. And having the courage to see that and to move forward becomes a critical one. The other main thing here that I think we capture is if you really get into the premarital prediction research, what it teaches us is that process matters. And it's the obvious process, like things like violence shouldn't be going on. That process can't be there. And how you manage conflict. And can you do that in a peer way without somebody trying to grab a hierarchy over the other, right? How do you handle that negative conflict? How do you manage personal issues? Have you come to terms with family of origin factors that may be influencing your current relationships? Do we manage mental health issues? Do we get help for addictions and other problems that may be in relationships? There's a number of things that we're understanding that the family background and individual factors and couple factors create a true understanding of which relationships succeed and which ones don't. My last thought for you is that one of the predominant views of young people today is that marriage is fragile and unpredictable. Yet we've seen studies now for 2 decades that have shown prediction models ranging from 66% to 90% prediction of which relationships ultimately stay together. That's pretty high prediction. We know those factors, and helping young people know what I would call the ecology of marriage, that ecosystem of factors that comes together, is what will help them have that preparation and readiness, how to evaluate their own readiness, to evaluate partners, to evaluate relationships in ways that can hopefully help them break through these paradoxes of marriage preparation. Thank you. Now you get to stand in front of all these people in food. It's not just me. So if you go to the microphone.
What do marriage scholars say about the hypothesis that women set the tone for sexual access?
I think the principle of least interest is pretty well accepted in relationship dynamics. That it's not just sexuality, but anything where there is a desire or interest discrepancy, that the person with the least amount of interest tends to have the most power and acts in the gatekeeping role. What we tend to try to teach couples and young couples with this is that if they will take an other-centered approach and focus on their partner, that you try to learn to focus on the things that you wouldn't naturally be the gatekeeper for. And the same thing happens. So it happens with emotional intimacy. And so maybe she's the higher desire spouse and he's lower. Then he's in the gatekeeper role of how much is there going to be that connection, that communication. If people can learn to foster their partner's preferences, particularly when it happens in a mutual way, you've actually got a chance of a relationship that can start to move beyond just the tit for tat, quid pro quo exchange ideas, and actually get to what Scott Stanley's work would talk about, sacrificial couples that actually move their identity from me to we as they come to sacrifice and view the couple as what they're invested in, not just simply getting my way. But yeah, my experience has been that principle of least interest is pretty well substantiated and accepted in both the research and the therapeutic circles.
Can you also explain why young women have bought into the hooked up culture in college? I know Grossman's book on Unprotected talks about, this friends with benefits and that the men get the benefits, the women don't get anything out of it. I mean, yet women continue to participate in this hooked up culture. What explains that?
I think it might be a little bit of a cascade effect. I think it's more complex than I'm going to explain it here, but I think there is something going on where if some start to participate, that changes the entire dynamic. Because now it is a question of not just simply, it's a matter of, will I be then left out? If that becomes a key criteria for young men in their partnering, that needs to be a part of the relationship. So what happens then to the woman who says, I won't do that? Now, Galena, you correct me here if this is wrong, because I'm going off of an old data point here. My memory is that the PrEP data showed that when it came to cohabitation, highly religious men had lower levels of cohabitation than the non-religious men, but that pattern didn't hold for women. That even the highly religious women were cohabiting at about the same level, and even if it wasn't necessarily in congruence with their beliefs and their values, it was kind of if I take a hard stance on that, I'm just never going to be in the dating pool or process at all. Is that really, did I get it right? Well, it just has always captured that idea that we see a willingness to say, is this what I feel like I have to do to be involved? And so there's a little bit of a cascade there, and you can see how that just starts to move more and more into the hookup kind of pattern of that. Now, at the same time, I think there's a lot of what Galena said, too, that I think there's also a lot of just saying, this is just young adulthood. One of the key messages right now is you're ready to get married when you have fully experienced the single life. Our data from a project called Project Ready in the School of Family Life at BYU found that 68% of young adults endorse that. And I don't think it's just fully experienced the single life. I think for some it's the I have sucked every last possible drop I can at a single life, and then I'll move into that pattern. So I think there's a light switch thing going on for some of them too. Here I'm going to do the casual sex, the doesn't mean anything, friends with benefits kind of approach. But yes, one day I'm going to marry, and I want this to be a deeply meaningful, significant symbol of the union I have with my spouse/soulmate. I'm not so sure that Humpty Dumpty is so easily put back together again, which I think is part of what we see of this data of sexual partners. Our data, and it's just one study, actually showed that number of sexual partners had the same effect for men and for women. So hopefully we don't have too much of a double standard going on there, but there's clearly, again, paradoxical effects of what's happening.
My understanding is that in England, the Victorian age was able to reverse some of the decadence that was taking place. Do you see that as a possibility in terms of reversing some of the things that have taken place with the sexual revolution?
No. To me, what it is still, at this point in time, it's still about those aspirations. You don't have to sell anybody. I mean, maybe there's a growing little portion, a little 10, 15%, but you don't have to sell successful lifelong marriage. I mean, here's a great one. Going back to those focus groups that I was doing with Scott and with Paul, we actually had a group one time, I think we were in Nashville. It was 20-something women that were cohabiting. And so they had done their whole focus group, and the focus group administrator gave them a task, came back behind the window and asked us, is there any questions you want me to ask them? I said, yes, I want you to go back in and ask that group of women who've been telling us for the last hour how wonderful cohabitation is, that if they went home tonight and their cohabitation partner said to them, I want to get married, but I'll only get married on one condition. We have to get married before the end of the month. Ask them how many of them would do it. What percent do you think it was? 100%. Every single one of them said that they would accept that marriage proposal and would be married, despite the fact they spent that last hour telling us how wonderful cohabitation was and they wouldn't change a thing. So I think what we have here in some ways too, and maybe this is getting back to this culture, there's expectations are different than aspirations. And there is a little bit of this hedge your bets and half a boyfriend's better than no boyfriend and take what you can get. And if I hold out for the ideal, if I truly go after my aspirations, that's going to fall short. So I think there's a pattern there too. I think we need to try to appeal to those aspirations because they're still there and help them see that the destination they want is very sound. It's the journey they think that will get them there that's starting to be so laden with these paradoxes.
You know, one of the things that you mentioned, that co-eds maybe don't want to feel left out, that they want to participate in. And I do some work in the inner city, and when I ask a 8th grader why they chose to have sex with a boy, they said, well, if I don't have sex, then my girlfriend will have sex with him. And it seems to me that women have bought in. Men, since Adam and Eve, have always lusted, have always wanted to have sex, and it seems to me it's the woman that tames the man. Marriage is the institution that does that, and yet women continue to buy into this kind of Sex in the City. You can have sex and then there's no consequences in terms of emotions and what it does to you. So I go back to the question, in a sense, do women set the moral tone in terms of sexual access and behavior? Because men are always going to be looking at
Yeah,
One girl can have sex with all the boys, and you can't rely on every last woman to be the gatekeeper for every man trying to have sex.
But we always had prostitution, right? So the thing is that it seems to me there's been a shift, and I don't know how you get that back.
Well, and part of this, what we might be talking about, is also fundamentally some subcultures developing. We haven't gotten into it too much today, and it's probably a whole other conversation, maybe even a whole conference. But what I'm seeing is we don't just fundamentally have married sex versus unmarried coupled sex pattern. We also have a portion of society that is truly moving towards an unmarried, hedonistic, unpartnered sexual approach. I'm very concerned about pornography acting in kind of a socialization, particularly with early exposure. Our 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old young men and an increasing number of young women, that clearly does not teach a monogamy ethic. It clearly does not emphasize. And so if the arousal template is set so early with those types of ideas of novelty, those types of ideas of unrealistic expectations and patterns, it could be, at least for a sub-portion, turning away from a marriage lifestyle in any shape or form. So we may be talking about some subpopulations here too that are doing some things very differently, where for some it's just simply I'm enjoying the single life, but I intend to do this in my married life. For others, it's a coupling strategy, and they hope it'll move them into that. And for others, it might be something that says this has got nothing to do with any of that. It's hedonism, materialism, individualism, and secularism are the paradigms of modernity that are on the rise that give a lot of justification to that type of approach and that type of validation to that type of adult living.
Did I see that one person? I think we have time for one more question.
You spoke about the premarital sex, this notion of not having premarital sex and how it affects future relationships. Have there been any studies done on you talked about the effects of dopamine and those neurotransmitters that are peaked after the sexual experience? Are there any studies that show, like the effect of a drug, is there a diminishing effect after you've had sex with for the first time, and then after that the effects diminish? And does that tie into if you've had premarital sex with another person and then you have sex with your partner, your life partner, the person that you're married to, does it kind of make you have feelings for this person that you had sex with the first time? And is there some value in saving that first experience with your marriage partner?
I think we see no doubt. Well, what we can see empirically is we do see this evidence of, for nothing else, what we could call an ethic of exclusivity. So whether it's people who cohabit and they end up marrying and that's the only person they're with. So when the single sexual experience and that's the person that they're with. We got to be a little bit careful with the brain research. We're still kind of teenagers playing with brain images, thinking we know what's going on and this part of the brain's lighting up and those types of things. So we need to be a little bit careful that it's not too deterministic. And I get quite worried too that if we take that too far, then the idea is, so what does that mean for me? That I've had sex with somebody before and I'm not going to marry them, and now I'm looking to get married and I've damaged any chance or possibility for that? We don't want to go to that point. I think there's a lot of ways that you can make your tape sticky. And I think it's a lot about sexual symbolism. I think it's about meaning making. We could have a very long conversation. There's not enough time for it. David Schnarch's model right now, and I think he's got some compelling evidence, is that when we understand that sexual response is only one part physical, right, that it's through the touch, but it is also predominantly psychological arousal. He's talking a lot about very different trajectories through the life course of what he calls genital prime versus true sexual prime. And his data, which tends to be more clinical, anecdotal case study at this point in time, is highlighting that many people don't even reach their true sexual prime until their 30s and 40s, and the maturity and the bonding and the deep symbol of a shared life together and a shared relationship comes on. Even when the neurological and biological data tells us the genital prime may be coming down a little bit, the ability to be truly authentic, to be truly with each other, allows the mind to truly eroticize and enjoy and experience that, and the body goes where the brain goes. The brain opens up all of that possibility. So to me, there's a connection with that. We want to see how the brain patterns are functioning and working, but be careful of not becoming too deterministic, too singular path with them. But I do know young people, it's quite an eye-opening idea to them to start talking about brain chemistry. And, they all walk around. I mean, a common phrase they all know. They all talk in high school about beer goggles, right? What's beer goggles? Well, it's when somebody's had enough drinks that they're seeing things differently, right? Well, let's talk a little bit about dopamine goggles or whatever that might be. That helps them to think a little bit more that this is actually influencing how they might make decisions, make choices. But I think we always want to keep all of the possibilities open, particularly when new meaning is given to the experience. The brain's ability to interpret and make sense of something will always be the most powerful part of brain response with these types of things. That's why that sexual symbolism and learning a model of symbolism, I think, is a pretty important way to go.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks.